Naomi Carter was 46 years old when the mining company told the town that her husband had killed 12 men with a single mistake. 3 days earlier, Eli Carter had gone underground before dawn with a metal lunch pail in one hand and coal dust still trapped in the lines of his knuckles. By sunset, the western tunnel of Blackstone Mine had collapsed beneath 200 feet of rock and timber. 12 miners never came home. The company said Eli ignored a warning light. They said he entered a sealed section without authorization. They said the collapse was his fault. By the end of the week, Naomi lost more than her husband. The company cut off her compensation claim, removed her from the payroll office where she had worked for 19 years, and nailed an eviction notice to the door of the company house where she and Eli had spent most of their marriage. Then, at a county auction nobody attended, Naomi spent her final $15 on something the entire town believed was worthless. A condemned mining tunnel, sealed since the collapse. The sheriff told her the place was dangerous. The auction clerk laughed quietly when she signed the paper. Even the old miners at the diner lowered their eyes when she mentioned Tunnel 7. But what nobody knew was that behind the collapsed wall deep inside, that mine was something Eli had died trying to protect. And once Naomi found it, the company that buried the truth would never control the town again. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories about forgotten people fighting their way back matter to you. Like this video and subscribe, because Naomi Carter's story begins in a town built on silence. Naomi grew up in a narrow mining valley outside Butte, Montana, where the mountains always looked darker than the sky behind them. In winter, soot settled over the snow before noon. In summer, the wind carried the smell of diesel, wet stone, and iron deep into the laundry hanging behind every house. The men in her family worked underground until their backs bent or their lungs failed. The women learned early how to wait. Wait for the truck headlights after dark. Wait for the noon whistle. Wait for the phone not to ring. Naomi's mother kept a small battery radio beside the kitchen sink because mining accidents were announced before supper on local stations. Whenever the announcer's voice changed tone, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. Naomi was 9 years old the first time she saw a widow collapse on her front porch. Mrs. Donnelly lived 3 houses away. Naomi still remembered the woman's yellow apron twisting in the wind as 2 mine supervisors climbed the porch steps without removing their hats. One carried folded paperwork beneath his arm. The other refused to meet the widow's eyes. Nobody on the street spoke while the woman screamed. By morning, the porch had already been cleaned. The mining town survived by teaching people how to bury grief quickly. Naomi learned something else that year. She learned that companies could rewrite a dead man's story before the dirt settled over his grave. Men who died because of broken beams or ignored warnings were often blamed for their own deaths because dead workers could not defend themselves. Years later, she would remember Mrs. Donnelly standing barefoot in the snow, clutching the porch railing with both hands while the company men drove away. And she would realize the same silence had finally come for her. Naomi never planned to work for the mining company. As a teenager, she imagined leaving the valley altogether, maybe becoming a school secretary somewhere far enough away that mountains no longer blocked the horizon. But when her father's lungs failed during her senior year of high school, she stayed. The only stable job she could find was inside the payroll office at Blackstone Mining. At first, the work seemed small and forgettable. She filed injury reports, copied shift logs, balanced overtime sheets, and sorted handwritten safety complaints into gray metal cabinets that smelled faintly of paper dust and machine oil. Most people barely noticed the women behind the office windows. But Naomi noticed everything. She learned how signatures changed when a man signed under pressure. She learned that accident reports were often rewritten 3 or 4 times before becoming official. She learned how numbers disappeared quietly when companies wanted problems to vanish. And she learned to keep copies. Not out of rebellion at first, mostly out of habit. She carried a small leather notebook in her purse and wrote things down constantly. Dates, missing forms, payroll delays, equipment failures, names of injured workers whose reports suddenly vanished. Eli used to tease her gently about it. "You remember more than the whole company combined," he once told her over coffee. But the object Naomi treasured most was not the notebook. It was Eli's old metal lunch pail. The blue paint had chipped away long before they married, and one corner was dented from falling against mine tracks years earlier. Every morning before dawn, Naomi packed his sandwiches into that pail while Eli buttoned his heavy work coat beside the stove. On difficult days, he would tap the lid twice before leaving, a quiet promise. "I'm coming home tonight." After the collapse, the company returned the lunch pail to Naomi, with dried mud still clinging to the bottom edge. The town changed its face toward Naomi less than a week after the collapse. At first, people still brought casseroles to the house. Old miners stopped by with lowered voices and rough hands folded awkwardly around coffee cups. Women from church left pies wrapped in towels beside the porch door. Nobody stayed very long, but the silence still felt human then. That changed when Blackstone Mining released its official statement. According to the company, Eli Carter had entered a restricted section of Tunnel 7 after repeated warnings from supervisors. The collapse, they claimed, was caused by unauthorized operational negligence. By the next morning, people stopped looking Naomi in the eye. At the grocery store, conversations ended when she entered an aisle. Men who had worked beside Eli suddenly stared at the floorboards inside the diner. Even the pastor sounded cautious during the memorial service, carefully avoiding any sentence that might challenge the company publicly. Then, the eviction notice arrived. A white envelope nailed directly through the front screen door of the company house. Blackstone-owned property must be vacated within 10 business days. Naomi stood on the porch for a long time, holding the paper while cold mountain wind pushed dead leaves across the yard. Inside the house, Eli's boots still rested beside the radiator. His jacket still hung near the kitchen door. For 19 years, Naomi had believed quiet loyalty could protect a person. But standing there with the notice trembling in her hands, she finally understood something the widows before her had learned long ago. The company did not merely bury miners underground. Sometimes it buried their names with them. And before winter arrived, Naomi Carter would be forced to decide whether to leave the valley behind forever or walk directly into the mine everyone else was too afraid to enter. Naomi met Eli Carter when she was 23 years old and carrying a cardboard box full of payroll ledgers across the Blackstone Mining parking lot during a spring rainstorm. One of the boxes split open near the loading dock. Papers scattered into muddy puddles while miners coming off the afternoon shift walked past without noticing. Naomi dropped to her knees, trying to rescue soaked timesheets before the ink dissolved. Then a pair of large hands appeared beside her. A miner, in a dust-covered jacket, crouched in the rain without saying a word and began gathering papers one at a time. That was Eli. He was not the loud kind of man. In Blackstone Valley, loud men usually drank too much, fought too often, and died younger than everyone expected. Eli spoke slowly, listened carefully, and carried exhaustion in his shoulders, even in his 20s. Coal dust always seemed trapped beneath his fingernails, no matter how hard he scrubbed. When he handed Naomi the last wet ledger, he noticed the small notebook tucked inside her coat pocket. "You write everything down?" he asked. "Only things worth remembering." He smiled at that. Most men in town treated mining like inheritance. Eli treated it like weather dangerous, unavoidable, and temporary if he could ever save enough money to leave. But money disappeared quickly in the valley. His younger brother needed surgery after a machinery accident. His mother lost part of her pension when the company changed ownership. Then the copper market crashed for nearly a year. Leaving became something they talked about instead of something they did. So they stayed. They rented a narrow company house near the edge of town with thin walls, uneven floors, and a furnace that groaned every winter like an old animal. Naomi planted tomatoes behind the porch during summers. Eli repaired things constantly because buying replacements cost too much. There were years when life almost felt steady. Not wealthy, not easy, but steady. They built routines the way other people built savings. Early coffee before dawn, Eli tapping his lunch pail twice before leaving for shift work. Naomi balancing payroll files under yellow office lights while old radios muttered weather reports nearby. Quiet suppers after dark while snow pressed softly against the windows. They never had children. At first, they thought there would be time later. Then Naomi miscarried during a hard winter after slipping on ice outside the post office. After that, the subject became something both of them touched carefully. Like a cracked dish, neither person wanted to break completely. Instead, they built their marriage around endurance. and for nearly 2 decades, endurance was enough. But the valley itself had begun changing long before the collapse. Blackstone Mining had been sold twice in 11 years. The newer executives came from out of state and arrived wearing polished boots too clean for the valley roads. Older miners stopped receiving direct answers about tunnel inspections. Safety complaints disappeared into offices without response. Entire crews were pushed into deeper sections of the mine after layoffs reduced staffing. At first, people grumbled quietly. Then men started getting hurt. A crushed hand near shaft 3. 2 broken ribs after faulty supports gave way. A gas leak covered up as equipment malfunction. Naomi noticed the paperwork before most people noticed the pattern. Reports vanished from filing cabinets. Injury claims were rewritten with softer language. Dates shifted. Maintenance requests appeared signed before equipment inspections had even occurred. One evening, nearly 8 months before the collapse, Eli sat heavily at the kitchen table and removed his helmet without speaking. Naomi immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? Eli rubbed coal dust across his forehead before answering. They're pushing crews too far west. Tunnel 7? He nodded once. That section should have been closed last year. Naomi looked toward the small leather notebook near the sugar jar. You reported it? Everybody reports it. Then why isn't anything changing? Eli gave a tired laugh without humor. Because Dead Rock doesn't scare executives sitting in Denver. After that night, the mine followed them home like weather. Eli woke coughing more often. Naomi noticed fresh bruises along his arms where loose timber had struck him underground. Once, she overheard 2 supervisors arguing outside the payroll office about inspection costs while workers waited nearby for overtime checks. The words stayed with her for weeks. We shut down Tunnel 7 now. Production drops 20%. So reinforce it. With what money? Late that autumn, Eli began carrying folded papers inside his lunch pail. At first, Naomi assumed they were shift schedules or equipment notes. But one night while he showered, she accidentally saw a corner of handwritten figures sticking out between napkins and sandwich wrappers. Ventilation failures. Support beam delays. Emergency complaints. Worker initials. When Eli walked back into the kitchen and saw the paper in her hands, his face changed immediately. Not anger. Fear. Where did you get this? She whispered. Nowhere. Ale. He lowered his voice instinctively, even though they were alone. If something happens to me, you keep that notebook of yours. Naomi stared at him. What are you talking about? But Eli only folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the lunch pail. A month later, Blackstone Mining announced record quarterly profits. 3 weeks after that, Tunnel 7 collapsed beneath 12 men. The funerals lasted 4 days. By the end of the week, the valley smelled of wet wool coats, cigarette smoke, church flowers, and thawing snow. Black cars lined narrow streets, while grieving families moved from one memorial service to another carrying casseroles. No one truly wanted to eat. Naomi stopped sleeping after the second funeral. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined Eli underground in darkness, trapped beneath timber and stone while the mountains settled above him inch by inch. Some nights, she woke convinced she had heard his boots near the porch door. Other nights, she sat at the kitchen table until dawn with his dented lunch pail in front of her, tracing the chipped blue paint with her thumb. The company paid for the funerals. People said that sentence as though it proved kindness. Blackstone executives arrived in polished trucks and dark coats, shaking hands beside fresh graves while photographers from the regional paper took pictures near the cemetery fence. They promised investigations. They promised support. They promised the valley would heal together. Then the official report was released. According to Blackstone Mining, Eli Carter had bypassed safety restrictions and entered an unstable western section of Tunnel 7 against direct instruction from supervisors. The report described him as an experienced miner who made an unauthorized operational decision under hazardous conditions. Naomi read the statement 3 times in the payroll office lobby while snow melted slowly from her boots. Around her, nobody spoke. Not the clunders she had worked beside for 19 years. Not the managers walking past carrying folders. Not even the security guard near the front entrance. The silence itself felt rehearsed. Finally, Naomi folded the paper carefully and walked upstairs toward administrative records. Mr. Garrison, the regional operations director, refused to invite her inside his office. He stood in the doorway instead, one hand gripping the frame while Naomi held the report in both hands to stop herself from shaking. "This is a lie." His expression barely moved. "The investigation is complete." "No," Naomi said quietly. "The paperwork is complete. That isn't the same thing." Garrison glanced down the hallway before lowering his voice. "Mrs. Carter, I strongly recommend you go home. My husband reported problems in Tunnel 7 for months. There's no record of that." Naomi felt something cold move through her chest. Because there had been records. She had seen them herself. Maintenance complaints, delayed reinforcement requests, unsigned hazard notices, forms that no longer existed. "You removed them," she whispered. Garrison's jaw tightened. "You should be careful about accusations right now." Naomi stared at him for several seconds before speaking again. "My husband knew that tunnel wasn't safe." "Your husband is dead, Mrs. Carter." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Not cruel, not emotional, just final. The kind of sentence spoken by men who expected silence afterward. But Naomi suddenly remembered Mrs. Donnelly standing barefoot on her porch decades earlier while company officials drove away without looking back. The same tone, the same ending. Only now the widow was her. 3 days later, Naomi's compensation claim was denied. The company cited Eli's documented negligence as grounds for rejecting survivor benefits. Without compensation, Naomi immediately fell behind on mortgage payments, heating bills, and medical debt left from Eli's final hospitalization years earlier after a cave-in injury. Then Blackstone terminated her payroll position. 19 years inside the same office ended with a short meeting that lasted less than 7 minutes. A younger supervisor, Naomi, had once trained herself, avoided eye contact while sliding termination papers across the desk, due to restructuring related to operational losses. Naomi almost laughed at the phrasing. Operational losses. 12 dead miners reduced to accounting language. When she returned home that evening, the company house already felt different. Not hers anymore. The radiator hissed weakly against the cold. Half-frozen wind pressed through gaps near the kitchen window frame. Eli's coat still hung beside the door, carrying the faint smell of coal dust and cedar soap. Naomi stood in the hallway for a long time before finally taking the coat down and folding it carefully into a cardboard box. That was the moment the truth settled fully into her bones. Blackstone was not simply refusing to help her survive. The company was erasing Eli. Every missing report, every altered document, every denied claim, every silence in town. It all served the same purpose. A dead miner blamed for his own death could not threaten profits. Within another week, the eviction notice arrived. The paper had been nailed directly through the front screen door hard enough to split the wood beneath it. Vacate property within 10 business days. Company Housing Division. Naomi read the notice twice before stepping back into the yard. Across the street, curtains shifted inside neighboring houses. People were watching. Not cruelly, fearfully. In Blackstone Valley, everyone understood the same unspoken rule. People who fought the company usually lost. That night, Naomi packed slowly. 1 suitcase for clothes, 1 box for kitchen items, a blanket Eli's mother had sewn years earlier, and the lunch pail. The old blue metal lunch pail sat alone on the kitchen table while the rest of the house emptied around it. Near midnight, Naomi finally opened it completely for the first time since the collapse. Inside, she found crumbs, rust along the hinges, folded napkins, and the faint smell of machine oil. At first, nothing else. Then her fingers touched something beneath the inner lining, a folded piece of paper hidden underneath the metal base. Naomi carefully pulled it free. It was not a letter. Not exactly. Just a list of dates, tunnel numbers, initials, and 1 sentence written hurriedly across the bottom in Eli's uneven handwriting. If they close the west shaft after inspection, nobody else dies. Naomi stared at the paper until her vision blurred. For the first time since the collapse, grief gave way to something sharper. Not hope. Not yet. But direction. The next morning, while snow drifted across the empty auction yard beside the courthouse, Naomi Carter spent her final $15 purchasing ownership of condemned Tunnel 7, the sealed section of mountain the company wanted forgotten forever. The deed to Tunnel 7 fit inside a single thin envelope. Naomi kept staring at it while the county clerk counted her $15 twice, as though embarrassed by the transaction itself. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old filing cabinets. Across the top, stamped in faded red ink, were the words, "Condemned industrial property, no liability assumed." The clerk slid the document across the counter carefully. "You understand nobody's been up there since the collapse?" Naomi nodded once. "The road washed out 2 winters ago," he continued, "and the west entrance is unstable. Sheriff's Department recommends nobody enter the site. You sold it anyway." The man looked uncomfortable. County wanted it off the books. Outside the courthouse, cold wind swept through the nearly empty parking lot. Naomi tucked the envelope into her coat and stood for a moment beside her aging pickup truck. Snow clouds hung low over the mountains west of town, turning the ridgelines dark blue beneath the afternoon sky. Tunnel 7. Eli had spent the last months of his life there. Now it belonged to her. The thought did not feel triumphant. It felt lonely. Naomi returned to the company house one final time before dawn the next morning. By then, most of the rooms were empty, except for scattered boxes and dust marks where furniture once stood. She loaded the truck slowly. Blankets, canned food, 2 lanterns, a toolbox Eli had repaired for years, several payroll notebooks, and a cast-iron skillet wrapped in towels. The lunch pail rode beside her on the passenger's seat. By sunrise, she locked the front door for the last time. Nobody came outside to watch her leave. The mining valley disappeared behind her gradually as the truck climbed narrow mountain roads coated in old ice and gravel. Telephone poles leaned against the wind along the roadside like exhausted men. Snow collected in the dead grass beneath rusted fences. Farther uphill, abandoned equipment yards appeared between pine trees, broken loaders, collapsed sheds, old drilling machines slowly disappearing beneath weather and silence. The farther Naomi drove, the older the mountain seemed. Blackstone Mining had once operated 6 active tunnel systems across the valley. Now only 2 remained open. The others sat abandoned along ridges and ravines, left behind after ore veins dried or accidents became too expensive to explain. Tunnel 7 lay farther west than the others. Too remote for tourists, too dangerous for scavengers, too painful for most former miners to revisit. Naomi drove nearly 3 hours before reaching the washed-out county road leading toward the sealed tunnel. Beyond that point, she had to continue slowly, over uneven ground, scarred by old mining tracks and landslide debris. More than once, she considered turning back. Not because she was afraid of the mine itself, because there was nothing waiting for her anywhere else. Around noon, snow began falling harder. The truck heater struggled against the cold while mountain fog drifted through the trees in pale gray sheets. Naomi tightened both hands around the steering wheel and followed what remained of the old access road deeper into the western ridge. Then she saw it. The remains of Blackstone Tunnel 7. The mine entrance sat halfway up a steep rocky slope surrounded by pine forest and collapsed equipment platforms. Rusted warning signs leaned crookedly near chain-link fencing bent inward by years of snow and neglect. Danger: unstable structure. Federal restriction notice. No entry authorized. The western loading shack beside the tunnel looked barely standing. Half the roof had collapsed beneath old snowfall. One side of the wooden structure sagged visibly toward the ravine below. Naomi parked slowly. For several moments, she remained inside the truck, listening to the engine tick softly in the cold. This was the place that had taken Eli from her. Even through the windshield, the mine felt heavy. Not haunted, burdened, as though the mountain itself remembered what had happened inside it. Naomi stepped out into ankle-deep snow. Wind moved sharply through the trees, carrying the metallic smell of wet stone and old machinery. Somewhere farther uphill, loose sheet metal banged rhythmically against a support frame. The tunnel entrance itself had been sealed with reinforced steel barriers after the collapse. Massive bolts held thick iron plates across the opening where miners once entered before dawn every morning. Snow had drifted against the lower edges of the barrier, partially burying old hazard tape still clinging to the fencing nearby. Naomi walked closer slowly. Her boots crunched over frozen gravel and broken timber. She stopped only a few feet from the steel barrier and placed one gloved hand against the cold metal. Eli had died somewhere beyond it. For a moment, she could almost picture him underground helmet light cutting through dust, boots against wet rock, one hand steadying old timber supports, while supervisors above ground counted production numbers instead of warning signs. Naomi lowered her head. Then she noticed something strange. Along the lower right corner of the steel barrier, beneath layers of rust and snow, faint scrape marks crossed the metal surface. Recent scrape marks. Not from the collapse. From movement. Someone had been there after the tunnel was sealed. The realization tightened something inside her chest. Naomi stepped back slowly and looked toward the broken loading shack nearby. One window had been boarded shut years earlier, but another stood slightly open beneath drifting snow. The wind pushed it gently against the frame with a soft, hollow knocking sound. Naomi stared at the dark opening for several long seconds. Then, she picked up Eli's toolbox from the truck bed and began walking toward the shack, deeper into the silence of the mountain nobody else wanted anymore. The closer Naomi walked toward the loading shack, the more the mountain seemed to swallow sound. Back in town, even silence carried noise beneath it: distant trucks, barking dogs, radios behind diner windows, furnace pipes knocking through old walls. But up here, beyond the abandoned western ridge, the quiet felt heavier than weather. Only the wind moved. It slipped through broken beams and twisted fencing with a low, hollow whistle that sounded almost human at times. Naomi climbed the sagging wooden steps carefully. Snow had drifted across half the porch, covering warped planks and rusted bolts beneath thin white layers. One side of the railing had collapsed completely into the brush below. The shack smelled like old timber, frozen dust, and damp iron. Inside, the darkness settled slowly around her while weak winter light filtered through cracked windows. The room had clearly once served as a supply station for miners entering Tunnel 7 decades earlier. Rusted hooks lined one wall where heavy coats and helmets once hung in rows before dawn shifts. A cracked bulletin board still carried fragments of yellowed notices pinned beneath curled tape. Most of the furniture had already been stripped years ago, but not everything. A small cast iron stove remained near the back wall beneath a rusted chimney pipe. One leg leaned unevenly against a stack of old boards, but the metal itself looked intact. Nearby sat a narrow cot frame missing half its mattress stuffing. And in the far corner, beneath fallen roofing debris, Naomi spotted a heavy red tool chest coated in dust. For the first time since arriving, she felt something small but solid move through her chest. Not comfort, possibility. The shack was barely standing, but it could shelter her from the mountain. Naomi set Eli's toolbox beside the stove and removed her gloves slowly, flexing numb fingers. The cold inside the shack bit harder than she expected. Every breath floated pale in the air. She moved carefully through the room, testing floorboards before placing weight on them. Several sagged dangerously beneath years of rot, but most still held. Near the rear wall, she found stacked firewood, protected beneath an overturned tarp, surprisingly dry beneath the outer layers. Someone had preserved it intentionally. That thought stayed with her. Naomi knelt beside the stove and opened its iron door. Old ash still rested inside beneath scraps of burned pine. She checked the chimney pipe next, shining her lantern upward through the darkness until she saw faint daylight near the top. Clear enough. She worked silently for nearly an hour, gathering usable wood, clearing debris away from the stove, and patching gaps near the broken window with flattened cardboard from supply boxes she found stacked against the wall. The labor steadied her breathing. For days after Eli's death, grief had left her feeling detached from her own body, as though she moved several seconds behind herself. But practical work forced her back into the present. Lift this board. Stack the wood. Tie the tarp tighter. Keep moving. By late afternoon, weak heat finally spread from the stove into the freezing room. Naomi sat on the floor beside it, wrapped in an old blanket, watching orange firelight flicker across warped wooden walls. Outside, snow continued falling through the trees in slow, drifting sheets. The mountain no longer looked hostile from inside the shack, only wounded. She opened one of the canned soup tins she had packed and warmed it carefully over the stove. The simple smell of broth filling the shack nearly brought tears to her eyes. For 19 years, she and Eli had eaten supper together at nearly the same hour every evening, even after arguments, even during hard winters when money barely covered heating oil. One cooked while the other set plates on the table. Now the silence across from her felt unbearable. Naomi lowered the spoon slowly and stared into the fire. "This should have been your place," she whispered. The words disappeared into the crackling stove. After supper, she continued exploring the shack by lantern light. Behind the supply counter, she discovered old ledgers swollen with moisture and useless from age. Most pages crumbled apart when touched. Nearby, several shelves still held mining tags, broken helmet lamps, rusted coffee tins, and cracked gloves stiff with time. The entire room felt abandoned in a hurry, as though people had once intended to return after the collapse but never truly did. Then Naomi found the locker room. A narrow hallway behind the supply area led to 3 small changing rooms partially buried beneath fallen support beams. 2 had already collapsed inward completely. The third still stood. Its metal lockers remained closed. Naomi pried one open carefully using a screwdriver from Eli's toolbox. Inside she found nothing valuable, only old work boots, a torn coat, and a miner's identification badge dated nearly 12 years earlier. But the second locker stopped her cold. Inside rested a hard hat with fresh dust missing from the surface. Not clean. Disturbed. Someone had touched it recently. Naomi stared at the helmet for several long seconds before slowly lifting it into the lantern light. Beneath the dust on the front brim, barely visible beneath scratches, were the faded, painted initials. A. Che. Eli Carter. A pulse of fear moved through her immediately. Not fear of ghosts. Fear of timing. The company claimed nobody entered the western site after the collapse, yet Eli's helmet sat hidden inside a shack locker instead of being logged with recovered equipment, which meant someone had removed it from the mine afterward. Naomi checked the locker again carefully. At the very bottom, beneath the coat lining, she found a folded strip of paper no larger than her hand. Most of the writing had smeared from moisture. Only a few words remained readable. West support wall. Ventilation records. Don't trust Garrison. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. Outside, wind struck the shack hard enough to rattle the loose window frame. For a brief moment, instinct told her to leave immediately. Drive back down the mountain. Forget the tunnel. Forget the records. Forget the dead men buried beneath the ridge. But then she remembered Garrison standing in the office doorway telling her there was no record of Eli's complaints. She remembered the eviction notice nailed through her front door. She remembered 12 funerals in 4 days. Naomi folded the damaged note carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she carried Eli's helmet back to the stove and set it beside the old lunch pail. Outside the shack, snow buried the western ridge deeper beneath darkness, while the sealed entrance to Tunnel 7 waited silently beyond the trees. And for the first time since Eli died, Naomi understood something with complete certainty. Her husband had not simply gone into that mine to work. Before the collapse, he had been trying to uncover something hidden inside it. Naomi barely slept that first night on the mountain. The shack groaned constantly beneath winter wind, every shifting board sounding like footsteps outside. Snow struck the roof in soft, uneven waves while the stove snapped and hissed beside the cot. Several times, Naomi woke suddenly, convinced she had heard metal scraping somewhere near the sealed tunnel. Each time she reached instinctively for Eli before remembering he was gone. By dawn, the fire had burned low enough that frost covered the inside corners of the shack windows. Naomi sat up slowly beneath the blankets and stared at Eli's helmet resting beside the stove. The faded initials on the brim no longer felt accidental. Someone had hidden it there. And if the company truly believed Eli alone caused the collapse, why remove his equipment from official recovery records afterward? The question followed Naomi through the entire morning. After reheating coffee over the stove, she carried a lantern outside and walked toward the tunnel entrance again. Overnight, snowfall had softened the entire ridge into pale silence. Pine branches bent beneath fresh snow, while old mining tracks disappeared almost completely beneath drifting white. Only the steel barrier remained dark against the mountain. Naomi crouched beside the scrape marks she had noticed the previous afternoon. In daylight, they looked even stranger. Thin lines cut through rust near the lower bolts as though someone had repeatedly loosened and tightened the metal plate over time. Not enough to fully open the barrier, just enough to move it. She brushed away snow carefully with her glove. Near the base of the barrier, partially hidden beneath ice and gravel, Naomi found cigarette ash, fresh enough that moisture had not fully frozen it yet. Someone had been there recently. She straightened slowly and studied the surrounding slope. Most of the old western platform had collapsed years earlier, leaving only unstable rock and twisted timber near the sealed entrance. But farther uphill, nearly hidden behind brush and snow-covered debris, Naomi noticed something else. A narrow utility trail. Almost invisible. The kind maintenance crews once used to reach ventilation shafts above the mine tunnels. She followed it cautiously. The trail climbed sharply through pine trees and broken stone for nearly 20 minutes before ending near a partially collapsed ventilation tower overlooking the western ridge. The structure leaned dangerously sideways, half swallowed by brush and snow, but sections of the metal ladder still remained attached. Naomi shined her lantern downward into the shaft opening. Cold air rose from below, carrying the deep mineral smell of wet stone. The mine still breathed. That realization unsettled her more than she expected. Tunnel 7 was supposed to be dead, but air still moved through the mountain beneath her feet. Naomi stepped carefully around the tower base and noticed old boot prints frozen beneath the snow along the far side of the structure. Not recent enough to identify clearly, but newer than the collapse itself. She followed the tracks toward a cluster of abandoned supply crates wedged beside the ridge wall. One crate had already been opened. Inside, she found rusted cables, damaged lantern parts, and broken respirator masks. Most were worthless. But beneath a torn canvas tarp at the bottom of the crate rested a small waterproof document tube. Naomi froze. The tube looked newer than everything else around it. She unscrewed the cap slowly. Inside was a rolled-up set of ventilation maps. Tunnel 7. Her pulse quickened immediately. Naomi carried the maps carefully back to the shack and spread them across the supply counter beneath lantern light. The paper edges had yellowed with age, but several sections contained newer markings drawn in dark pencil. Measurements, arrows, support notes, and repeated circles around one section labeled West Retention Wall Section C. Naomi stared at the markings. That area sat directly behind the collapse zone. Someone, likely Eli, had been studying structural failures before the accident. Then she noticed another detail. Near the bottom edge of the map, partially erased beneath graphite smudges, a sentence had been written hurriedly in familiar, uneven handwriting. Records moved before inspection. Check hidden chamber near old compressor room. Naomi stopped breathing for a moment. The compressor room. She remembered hearing miners mention it years earlier. An old maintenance chamber near the western shaft used decades ago before newer systems were installed. According to company records, the area had supposedly collapsed long before the final disaster. Supposedly. Naomi looked again toward the sealed tunnel outside the shack window. If Eli had discovered records being moved before inspection, then the collapse itself might not have been simple negligence. It might have been concealment. The thought terrified her because it changed everything. A dangerous company cutting corners was one thing. A company hiding evidence before miners died was something else entirely. Naomi folded the maps carefully and sat beside the stove trying to think clearly. Fear moved through her in quiet waves, now not panic, but awareness. If Eli found evidence before the collapse, then someone else likely knew about it too. And if those records still existed somewhere inside the mountain, Blackstone Mining would never allow them to surface willingly. Outside, clouds darkened over the ridge while afternoon snow thickened again between the trees. Naomi rubbed tired hands across her face and glanced once more toward Eli's helmet. For years, she had believed mining accidents were caused by bad luck, unstable stone, or exhausted men forced into dangerous work. But now, another possibility stood in front of her. What if the collapse had not simply buried evidence? What if the collapse had protected someone? The stove crackled softly behind her, while wind moved against the shack walls. Then, somewhere far outside near the sealed tunnel entrance, Naomi heard the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal. Once, then again. She stood immediately. Someone else was on the mountain. Naomi extinguished the lantern instinctively. The shack dropped into near darkness, except for the faint orange glow spilling from the stove. Outside, wind continued pushing snow across the ridge. But beneath it, she heard the sound again. Metal against metal. Slow. Deliberate. Not the random shifting of old equipment. Someone was working near the tunnel entrance. Naomi remained perfectly still beside the supply counter, listening carefully. Her heartbeat thudded hard enough she could feel it in her throat. For a moment, she considered staying hidden until whoever it was left the mountain. Then, she remembered the scrape marks on the steel barrier. Someone had already been returning to Tunnel 7 for a long time. If she hid now, the truth would disappear again. Naomi reached quietly for Eli's heavy flashlight and moved toward the shack door without turning the lantern back on. Snow blew sharply against her face the moment she stepped outside. The western ridge had nearly vanished into gray evening fog. At first, she saw nothing. Then, movement flickered near the steel barrier below the slope. A figure in a dark coat stood beside the sealed entrance, partially crouched near the lower bolts. Naomi instinctively stepped behind a pine tree as the figure shined a narrow flashlight along the metal plates. Not a sheriff. Not county workers. The movements were too cautious. The figure suddenly stopped and looked uphill. Naomi held her breath. After several long seconds, the person tightened something near the barrier with a wrench before quickly disappearing into the trees west of the tunnel. By the time Naomi reached the entrance, whoever it was had vanished completely. Only fresh boot prints remained in the snow. And near the lower bolts, partially hidden beneath ice, Naomi found something else. One of the steel fasteners had been loosened enough to expose a narrow gap between the barrier plates. Cold air flowed steadily through it from deep inside the mountain. Naomi stared at the opening, while fear and determination fought quietly inside her chest. Then she crouched and shined Eli's flashlight through the gap. Darkness swallowed the beam almost immediately. But several feet inside the tunnel, barely visible beneath fallen rock and dust, she saw an old electrical maintenance cart still resting against the wall tracks. And beyond it, a faint painted number. C section, West Retention Wall. The same area marked repeatedly on the ventilation maps. Naomi backed away slowly. She should have waited. She should have gone back to town, contacted state inspectors, maybe even the press first. But another thought pushed harder against her mind. If someone else kept returning to the tunnel, the records Eli mentioned might disappear before morning. By full dark, Naomi had made her decision. She spent nearly 2 hours preparing carefully inside the shack. Heavy coat, rope, lantern batteries, work gloves, Eli's old respirator mask from the tool chest. She copied sections of the ventilation maps into her notebook and wrapped them in oilcloth against moisture. Finally, she carried the bolt wrench she found near the barrier back down through the snow. The mountain looked enormous beneath the night sky. Wind moved through the trees with low, mournful sounds, while distant clouds covered most of the moon. Naomi worked slowly at the loosened bolts, every metallic turn echoing louder than expected across the ridge. Twice she stopped, certain someone was watching from the trees. Nothing moved. After nearly 20 minutes, the narrow opening widened enough for her to squeeze through sideways. The air inside the mine hit immediately. Cold, wet, heavy with stone dust and rust. Naomi stepped carefully onto the abandoned tracks, while flashlight beams cut through drifting particles hanging in the darkness. Water dripped steadily, somewhere deeper underground. Old support beams lined the tunnel walls, many cracked or splintered beneath pressure from the mountain above. Every instinct told her to leave. But Eli had walked these same tracks for years. So Naomi kept moving. The deeper sections of Tunnel 7 looked frozen in the exact moment disaster struck. Abandoned helmets rested beside overturned carts. Rusted tools lay scattered beneath layers of dust. One wall carried faded chalk marks, listing production numbers from the week before the collapse. Then Naomi noticed something stranger. Certain areas looked too clean, not maintained, disturbed. Footprints crossed sections of dust that should have remained untouched for years. Several fallen beams had been moved aside recently enough that exposed wood still looked pale beneath broken surfaces. Someone had absolutely been returning underground. Naomi followed the maps carefully toward the western retention section. Several tunnels had partially collapsed completely, forcing her through narrow maintenance corridors thick with moisture and loose rock. Once, a section of ceiling groaned sharply overhead, sending stone fragments raining against the tracks nearby. She nearly turned back then, but farther ahead she finally saw it. A faded maintenance sign hanging crookedly beside a reinforced side chamber. Compressor, room, C. Naomi's flashlight trembled slightly as she approached. The steel door had collapsed inward decades earlier. Broken pipes and damaged machinery filled most of the room beyond it. At first glance, everything appeared abandoned. Then she noticed fresh scrape marks along the floor. Near the rear wall, partially hidden behind rusted compressor tanks, several crates had been stacked deliberately. Naomi moved toward them slowly. Her breathing sounded painfully loud inside the respirator mask. The first crate contained old maintenance files ruined by moisture. The second held broken tools. But the third crate changed everything. Inside rested dozens of sealed record ledgers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, payroll logs, inspection reports, worker injury files, death records. Naomi stared at the dates. Some were over 40 years old, others far more recent, and many carried official company seals that never appeared in public records. Hands shaking, Naomi opened the nearest ledger. Her stomach turned immediately. The pages listed structural warnings repeatedly ignored across multiple tunnel systems. Entire sections had been marked unsafe years before workers entered them. Ventilation failures were hidden. Inspection signatures were forged. Several dead miners listed publicly as operator negligence had actually reported safety hazards shortly before dying. Naomi flipped pages faster now. The pattern repeated over decades. Men blamed after death. Families denied compensation. Unsafe shafts quietly reopened after inspections. Then, she found Tunnel 7. Dozens of missing complaints appeared across the pages in Eli's handwriting and others she recognized from payroll records. Hazard reports she personally remembered filing years earlier had been hidden here instead of processed officially. And beneath those reports rested something even worse. A sealed black notebook labeled, Private Liability Review, Internal Use Only. Naomi opened it carefully. Inside were executive meeting summaries discussing cost projections related to tunnel reinforcement. One sentence near the middle of the notebook stopped her cold. Tunnel 7 closure, not financially viable before Q4 extraction targets completed. Another line beneath it. Fatality risk acceptable compared to operational interruption. Naomi physically staggered backward. They knew. The company knew the tunnel could collapse. And they kept miners underground anyway. For several moments, Naomi could barely breathe. 12 men buried beneath the mountain. Not because of accident. Not because of Eli. Because executives decided reinforcing the tunnel cost too much money. Then, she discovered the final page. Attached inside the notebook with a rusted paperclip was a folded handwritten statement signed by Eli Carter 3 weeks before the collapse. Naomi unfolded it carefully. If anything happens in Tunnel 7, the company cannot claim ignorance. Workers repeatedly warned management about West support failures. Copies of ventilation reports were removed before inspection. I am leaving this record because they are going to blame the dead. Eli Carter. Naomi covered her mouth with one shaking hand. For the first time since the collapse, grief broke through her completely. Not quiet grief. Not widow's exhaustion. Rage. Deep. Cold. Steady. Eli knew. He knew they might bury the truth with him. That was why he hid records. Why he warned her to keep notes. Why he looked afraid the night she discovered papers inside the lunch pail. Naomi lowered herself slowly onto an overturned crate while the flashlight beam trembled across the chamber walls. The company had not merely stolen compensation. They had sacrificed men. Generations of them. And suddenly Naomi understood why someone kept returning to Tunnel 7 after the collapse. Not to recover equipment, to make sure these records never left the mountain. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the tunnel behind her, Naomi heard footsteps crunching slowly across gravel. The footsteps stopped. Naomi froze beside the crates, one hand still gripping Eli's statement while the flashlight beam shook faintly across the compressor room wall. For several seconds, the mine became perfectly silent, except for dripping water somewhere farther down the tunnel. Then a man's voice echoed through the darkness. You shouldn't be down here alone. Naomi turned sharply toward the tunnel entrance. An older miner stepped into the flashlight beam, slowly with both hands visible at his sides. His heavy coat carried snow across the shoulders, and his beard was streaked with gray coal dust that never seemed to leave certain men even after retirement. Naomi recognized him immediately. Walter Grady, former union organizer, black lung survivor, one of the few miners in town who had openly argued with Blackstone management years earlier before being forced into early retirement. Walter removed his hat slowly. "I saw the truck outside," he said quietly. "Figured it had to be you." Naomi did not lower the flashlight. "How long have you been following me?" "Not following." He glanced toward the crates behind her, protecting what's left. The answer unsettled her more than denial would have. Walter's eyes moved toward the ledgers already spread open nearby. The expression on his face told Naomi he already knew what was hidden inside the compressor room. "You knew about this." Walter gave a tired nod. "Not all of it, but enough." Naomi stared at him in disbelief. 12 men died. "I know. You knew the company hid records and you said nothing?" Walter's jaw tightened beneath the lantern light. "You think nobody tried?" The words echoed harder than shouting. Walter stepped farther into the room now, boots grinding softly against loose gravel. "Men reported Tunnel 7 for years. We filed complaints with the state twice. Company lawyers buried both investigations before they reached Helena. One inspector lost his job. Another suddenly changed his report after a meeting in Denver." Naomi's anger shifted uneasily. "Then why didn't anyone go public?" Walter laughed bitterly. "You ever watched a mining town starve?" He gestured toward the tunnel walls around them. "Blackstone owns half the valley. Houses, equipment contracts, fuel accounts, medical insurance. They bury one story, promise jobs stay open another year, and people convince themselves survival matters more than truth." Naomi looked again at Eli's statement in her hand. He knew they'd blame him. Walter's eyes lowered briefly. Eli wasn't supposed to die that day. The sentence hit Naomi like sudden cold water. "What?" Walter moved closer to the crates and lifted one of the hidden ledgers carefully. "Your husband planned to bring copies of these records to a federal safety investigator coming through Billings 2 days later." He paused. "But somebody warned management." Naomi felt the entire room tilt slightly around her. "You're saying the collapse wasn't accidental?" "I'm saying support failures don't happen that fast without warning signs." Walter's voice dropped lower. "And I'm saying certain sections should have been evacuated weeks before those men ever entered the west shaft." Naomi suddenly remembered the stranger outside the tunnel earlier that evening. Someone else protecting the secret. Or protecting the company. "Who keeps coming back here?" she asked quietly. Walter's expression darkened. "Probably company retrieval crews. Maybe private security." He looked toward the tunnel entrance. "Once they realize records survived underground, they'll tear this mountain apart to find them." Naomi's pulse quickened again. Then she understood the real danger. Not the unstable mine. The evidence. If these records disappeared, Blackstone would bury the truth permanently. Walter seemed to read the realization on her face. "You need to leave tonight." "No. Naomi. They killed my husband. And they'll ruin you too if you walk into town waving those papers around without protection." Walter's voice remained calm, but urgency pressed beneath every word now. "You think Blackstone executives are afraid of widows? They've survived lawsuits before. They'll call you unstable, emotional, desperate for settlement money." He pointed toward the ledgers. "Those documents matter only if they reach people the company can't intimidate first." Naomi folded Eli's statement carefully. "Then we make copies." Walter looked at her for several long seconds. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not trust completely, recognition. He finally saw that Naomi was not going to walk away quietly like the company expected. By dawn, they had packed as many records as possible into waterproof mining sacks hidden beneath blankets and supply tarps inside Naomi's truck. Walter insisted the originals remain buried temporarily inside the compressor room until safer arrangements could be made. "Too risky carrying everything at once," he warned. Naomi hated leaving any evidence behind, but he was right. If the truck got stopped on mountain roads, Blackstone would destroy everything before the documents reached anyone important. Snow continued falling as they worked. The storm helped cover fresh tracks around the tunnel entrance, but it also made the roads dangerous. By sunrise, the western ridge had nearly disappeared beneath white fog and drifting pine shadows. Before leaving, Naomi looked once more toward the sealed tunnel. 12 men remained buried inside that mountain, and now she carried proof they never should have died. The drive back toward town felt longer than before. Walter followed behind in his aging truck while Naomi gripped the steering wheel tightly enough her fingers ached. Every approaching vehicle made her stomach tighten. Twice, she checked the rearview mirror, convinced someone was following them through the storm. Halfway down the ridge road, they passed a black company SUV parked near an abandoned fuel station. Two men stood beside it, smoking cigarettes. Neither wore mining gear. Both watched Naomi's truck too carefully as she drove past. Walter's headlights flashed once behind her. "Keep driving." By the time they reached Blackstone Valley, word had already started spreading that Naomi Carter returned from Tunnel 7. Mining towns moved information quickly. Fear moved faster. At the diner near Main Street, conversations stopped when Naomi entered beside Walter carrying two sealed document bags. Several former miners lowered their eyes immediately. Others stared openly. Then, Naomi saw Mr. Garrison sitting alone near the back counter drinking coffee. The regional operations director looked up slowly as she entered. No surprise crossed his face. Only calculation. He stood carefully, adjusted his coat cuffs, and walked toward her through the silent diner. Walter shifted slightly beside Naomi. Garrison stopped several feet away. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "I heard you've been trespassing on restricted company property." Naomi met his eyes evenly. "I own Tunnel 7. Legally speaking, you own condemned surface access rights." Garrison's smile never reached his eyes. Federal liability restrictions still apply underground. Walter stepped forward. "Careful, Richard." Garrison ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Naomi. "You've been through a terrible loss," he said softly. "People in grief sometimes convince themselves they've found patterns that aren't really there." Naomi felt rage move coldly beneath her ribs. Then Garrison glanced briefly toward the sealed document bags near her boots. The movement lasted less than a second, but Naomi noticed it. And so did Walter. Garrison knew, maybe not exactly what she found underground, but enough to be afraid. The executive lowered his voice further. "Some things buried in that mountain are dangerous to disturb." Naomi answered quietly, "You should have remembered that before sending men down there." For the first time since the conversation began, something sharp flickered behind Garrison's expression. Not guilt. Fear. Real fear. And Naomi finally understood something important. The company was no longer trying to protect its reputation. It was trying to survive what Eli Carter left behind. By the following morning, Naomi understood two things clearly. First, Blackstone Mining already suspected she had recovered evidence from Tunnel 7. Second, she could not survive the fight alone. The realization unsettled her more than the threats themselves. For most of her life, Naomi survived by staying quiet, working steadily, and avoiding attention. In mining towns, people learned early that endurance mattered more than pride. You kept your head down. You paid bills on time. You did not challenge the company unless you wanted your name whispered behind closed doors. But Eli's statement kept replaying inside her mind. "They are going to blame the dead." That sentence no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to every widow in the valley. Walter brought her to the back room of an old feed supply store on the edge of town later that afternoon. The business technically belonged to his cousin, though hardly anyone came there anymore except retired miners and ranchers buying winter supplies. The room smelled like coffee grounds, rope fibers, machine grease, and wet wool coats drying near a heater vent. 3 people waited inside. Naomi recognized all of them. Rose Donnelly sat nearest the stove, wrapped in a thick brown sweater. Her husband died in a tunnel collapse nearly 30 years earlier. The same widow Naomi remembered screaming barefoot on her porch as a child. Age had bent her shoulders now, but her eyes remained sharp. Beside her sat Miguel Alvarez, a former ventilation mechanic forced into retirement after Blackstone claimed his lungs were too damaged for underground work. Naomi remembered processing his medical paperwork herself years earlier. The third person surprised her most. Leah Whitaker, 28 years old, reporter for the small county newspaper. Naomi had seen her around town taking photographs during funerals and council meetings, usually ignored by Blackstone executives because local papers rarely reached beyond the valley. Walter closed the door carefully behind them. "No phones," he said quietly. Leah immediately removed a small tape recorder from her coat pocket and placed it on the table without argument. Naomi studied the group uneasily. "You all know?" Rose answered first. "We know enough." Miguel leaned forward slowly, breathing harder than healthy men should after simple movement. Walter told us what you found underground. Naomi hesitated. Even now, speaking the truth aloud felt dangerous. Then she removed Eli's statement from her coat pocket and placed it carefully on the table. Silence settled across the room while the others read. Rose's hands trembled slightly near the bottom of the page. "They blamed my husband too," she whispered. Nobody spoke immediately afterward, because everyone in the room understood what the statement meant. Not one accident. A pattern, decades long. Leah finally looked up. "If these records are real, this is bigger than Blackstone Valley." Naomi answered quietly. "They're real." Leah's reporter instincts sharpened immediately. "How many ledgers?" "Dozens." "Injury reports too?" "Yes." "Names?" Naomi nodded. Miguel swore softly beneath his breath. Walter moved toward the small coffee pot near the counter. "The company buried safety violations for years," he said. "Maybe longer." Rose stared into the heater flames without blinking. "They always pick the dead men," she murmured. "The dead can't argue back." Naomi suddenly remembered something. She turned toward Rose carefully. "When your husband died." Rose gave a bitter smile before Naomi even finished. "They said he ignored evacuation warnings." Her eyes hardened slightly. "Tom spent 15 years training younger miners to follow safety procedures better than supervisors did." Miguel nodded once. "Same story happened in Shaft 4 back in '98. And Northridge before that," Walter added quietly. Leah looked around the room slowly now. "You're telling me this company has been hiding fatal negligence for generations?" Nobody answered immediately, because saying it aloud made it real. Naomi finally opened one of the waterproof document bags and removed several copied ledgers. The old papers spread across the table beneath weak overhead lights while everyone leaned closer. Maintenance delays, ignored inspections, unsigned hazard reports, repeated warnings from miners. Leah photographed page after page silently. Then, she stopped at a particular document and looked up sharply. "Wait." She pointed toward a signature line near the bottom of one inspection report. "This state inspector, he's still alive." Walter frowned. "You sure?" "He retired in Helena." Leah traced the name again carefully. "I interviewed him once years ago about mine closures." Naomi felt the first real movement of hope since Eli died. Not emotional hope. Practical hope. A witness. Miguel coughed harshly into a handkerchief before speaking again. "If inspectors signed reports saying those tunnels were safe, Blackstone won't fall without proof they knew otherwise." Naomi reached into her coat slowly. Then she placed the black liability notebook from the compressor room onto the table. The room went completely still. Walter opened it carefully while the others watched. No one spoke while he turned pages. When he finally reached the sentence about acceptable fatality risk, even his hands tightened visibly against the paper edges. Leah whispered the words aloud like she could barely believe them. Fatality risk acceptable compared to operational interruption. Miguel removed his glasses slowly. My God. For the first time since the collapse, Naomi watched fear shift away from herself and toward the company. The truth had weight now. Names. Records. Intent. Rose looked directly at Naomi across the table. "What do you want to do?" Naomi thought about the question carefully. Only days earlier, survival itself had felt uncertain. Now, an entire valley seemed balanced around her answer. Outside, snow drifted softly past the feed store windows while trucks moved slowly through evening streets coated in ice. Somewhere downtown, Blackstone executives were likely already preparing lawyers, statements, denials. They would expect panic, emotion, desperation. Instead, Naomi spoke calmly. "We make copies of everything." Walter nodded once. Leah leaned forward immediately. "I can get records out of county before Blackstone knows how much survived." Miguel tapped several inspection reports with rough fingers. "And I know retired miners who'll talk if they believe someone finally has proof." Rose's tired eyes filled slightly with tears. "Then maybe our husbands stop dying as liars." The sentence settled over the room quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, just true. And Naomi realized something important then. The company built its power through isolation. Widows left alone, workers afraid separately, families grieving privately. But once people began speaking together, the silence Blackstone depended on started breaking apart. Walter closed the liability notebook carefully. You understand what happens next. Naomi nodded. They'll come after all of us. Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then, the old union organizer gave the first genuine smile Naomi had seen since Eli's funeral. Good, he said softly, means they're scared. Blackstone Mining moved faster than Naomi expected. Within 3 days, company lawyers flooded the county courthouse with injunction requests claiming Naomi illegally obtained restricted corporate documents from federally condemned property. Local radio stations suddenly began repeating phrases like incomplete evidence, emotionally unstable widow, and unauthorized trespassing. The Valley had heard those tactics before. Question the victim. Complicate the truth. Delay everything until people grow tired. But this time the story spread beyond the mountains before Blackstone could bury it. Leah Whitaker mailed copies of the ledgers and Eli's statement to newspapers in Helena, Denver, and Billings. Walter contacted retired union organizers across the state. Miguel tracked down former inspection workers willing to testify quietly if federal investigators arrived. And most importantly, the widows started talking. One by one, women who spent decades swallowing company explanations began opening old boxes hidden inside closets and basements. Termination letters, compensation denials, unanswered safety complaints, medical records, handwritten notes from dead husbands who knew tunnels were unstable long before official reports admitted it. The pattern became impossible to ignore. By the second week, federal labor investigators arrived in Blackstone Valley. The company responded by organizing a public town hearing inside the old county administration building, officially framed as a transparency meeting, though everyone understood the real purpose. Control the narrative before the investigation spread further. The hearing took place during a hard snowstorm that turned the valley gray before noon. Naomi arrived early with Walter and Leah, carrying 3 document boxes tied carefully with rope. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps outside, while miners gathered in uneasy groups beneath falling snow. Some supported her openly now. Others still looked afraid. Blackstone remained the valley's largest employer. Truth did not erase hunger overnight. Inside the hearing room, rows of folding chairs filled slowly beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Old radiators knocked unevenly against the walls, while county officials whispered nervously near the front tables. Naomi spotted Garrison immediately. He sat beside 3 company attorneys wearing the same polished calm she remembered from payroll meetings years earlier. But now she noticed details she once overlooked: the stiffness in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the table whenever reporters aimed cameras toward him. Fear lived inside him now, too. The hearing began with procedural statements nobody truly listened to. Then Blackstone's lead attorney stood. His name was Richard Vale, a tall, silver-haired lawyer from Denver whose suit probably cost more than Naomi's truck. He spoke smoothly about tragic accidents, economic hardship, and emotional misinformation spreading through grieving communities. Every sentence sounded polished enough to survive newspapers. Then he turned toward Naomi. "Mrs. Carter," he began calmly, "is a woman experiencing extraordinary personal loss. Unfortunately, grief can sometimes encourage individuals to misunderstand incomplete technical information." Naomi felt Walter tense beside her, but she remained still. Vale continued. "The materials removed from Tunnel 7 represent partial maintenance archives lacking engineering context. Presenting such fragments publicly risks misleading both the community and federal reviewers." Leah leaned closer and whispered softly, "He's trying to make this sound too complicated for ordinary people." Naomi understood that already. Complexity protected powerful systems, especially in towns where miners rarely held law degrees. Then Vale made his mistake. "We sympathize deeply with Mrs. Carter's emotional state," he said, "but sympathy cannot replace expertise." The room shifted slightly. Naomi saw several widows exchange looks. Not anger yet. Recognition. The same tone company officials always used with women left behind after accidents. Too emotional, too confused, too uneducated to understand technical realities. County officials finally opened the floor for evidence review. Walter squeezed Naomi's shoulder once. "This is your moment." Naomi stood slowly. For an instant, fear hit hard enough she nearly lost her breath. The room suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too bright beneath overhead lights. Reporters adjusted cameras toward her while company attorneys watched carefully across the tables. She thought about Eli Underground, about Rose Donnelly barefoot in the snow decades earlier, about every widow taught silence was dignity. Then Naomi carried the first ledger to the evidence table. No dramatic speech. No trembling outrage. Only facts. "These are original maintenance reports from Tunnel 7, she said quietly. Many were removed from official filing systems before inspection reviews. Vale immediately stood. "There is no verified chain of custody." Naomi interrupted calmly. "The signatures are Blackstone signatures." That stopped him briefly. She opened the ledger carefully beneath the overhead lights. Here, Naomi pointed toward one section. Ventilation failure warnings submitted 11 months before the collapse. Another page. Support beam requests delayed 4 consecutive quarters. Another. Repeated recommendations to close the west retention section. The room grew quieter with every page. Then Naomi placed Eli's statement onto the table. Her hands shook slightly now, but her voice did not. "My husband knew the company intended to blame the dead." Vale stepped forward sharply. "This statement cannot be independently verified." Naomi met his eyes directly for the first time. "No," she answered softly, "but the records buried beside it can." Several reporters immediately began writing faster. Vale shifted tactics. "Mrs. Carter," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "you worked payroll administration, correct?" "Yes." "So, you are not an engineer?" "No." "Not a mining safety specialist?" "No." "Not a federal inspector?" Naomi waited. The attorney folded both hands neatly. Then respectfully, "How could you possibly determine which technical decisions were reasonable under underground operating conditions?" The question hung carefully in the room. Walter cursed quietly beneath his breath. But Naomi suddenly remembered something Eli once told her during a tax season when payroll supervisors tried hiding overtime discrepancies. "People think confusion protects them because most workers get scared of paperwork." So Naomi answered simply, "I can read dates." The room went silent. Naomi lifted another ledger. "I can read signatures." Another page. "And I can compare reports removed before inspections with reports submitted afterward." She looked directly toward Garrison now. "You can question my education." Her voice stayed calm. "You cannot change the facts." A ripple moved visibly through the hearing room. Even some miners near the back nodded slowly. Vale tried interrupting again. "These documents require expert interpretation." "No," Naomi said firmly. "Dead miners required protection." That line landed harder than she intended. Not because it sounded rehearsed. Because everyone in the valley knew it was true. Then came the final blow. Leah Whitaker carried forward enlarged copies of the liability notebook pages, including the sentence, "Blackstone executives never expected outsiders to see. Fatality risk, acceptable compared to operational interruption." For the first time all afternoon, Richard Garrison visibly lost control of his expression. Only briefly. But Naomi saw it. So did the reporters. Federal investigators immediately requested the original notebook for examination. Vale protested furiously now, demanding procedural delays and authentication reviews, but the hearing room had already changed. People no longer looked at Naomi like a grieving widow chasing blame. They looked at Blackstone like a company caught hiding bodies behind paperwork. Then Rose Donnelly stood unexpectedly from the back row. 78 years old now, hands shaking slightly, but standing. "My husband died in Shaft 2, she said into the silence. "They blamed him too." Another widow stood beside her. Then, another. One by one, women across the room rose slowly carrying old letters, reports, compensation denials, and folded papers worn soft by decades of handling. The sight hit the room harder than any legal argument. Not outrage. Accumulation. A valley full of buried grief finally refusing burial. Naomi looked around the hearing room and suddenly realized something extraordinary. Blackstone had spent generations isolating widows one at a time, but now the company faced all of them together. Federal investigators suspended the hearing before sunset. Outside, snow still fell steadily across the courthouse steps while reporters crowded around Naomi beneath camera lights. She did not smile, did not celebrate. She only held Eli's lunch pail tightly against her coat, while watching miners emerge slowly from the courthouse doors into the storm. For the first time in decades, the valley no longer looked silent. The federal investigation lasted 7 months. Winter passed first. Then, spring runoff flooded the lower roads along the valley, while reporters continued arriving from outside counties almost every week. Blackstone executives denied wrongdoing publicly for as long as they could, but once investigators opened the hidden records from Tunnel 7, the company's explanations began collapsing faster than the mine itself. Internal memos surfaced. Inspection reports disappeared from state archives, only to reappear inside Naomi's evidence boxes. Former supervisors accepted immunity deals and admitted production quotas routinely overrode safety recommendations. 3 retired engineers testified that Tunnel 7 should have been permanently closed nearly 2 years before the collapse. And slowly, the story changed. Not only inside newspapers, inside the valley itself. Men who once avoided Naomi in grocery stores began stopping beside her truck to shake her hand quietly. Former miners brought coffee and firewood to the mountain shack during late storms. Widows who had not spoken publicly in decades started sharing their husbands' names with reporters instead of hiding photographs in dresser drawers. The silence Blackstone depended on never fully returned. Richard Garrison resigned first, officially for health reasons. 2 months later, federal prosecutors announced criminal negligence charges against several senior company officials tied to falsified inspection practices and concealed hazard reports. Lawsuits followed almost immediately afterward. For the first time in living memory, Blackstone Mining looked afraid of the people beneath it. Naomi attended the final federal hearing in Helena during early autumn. She wore a dark blue coat. Leah helped her choose and carried Eli's lunch pail beside her briefcase of copied records. Reporters waited outside the building steps while miners and widows filled the courtroom gallery quietly behind her. The hearing itself lasted nearly 6 hours. Experts testified. Lawyers argued. Executives blamed procedures, subcontractors, market pressures, communication failures. But the truth had become too large to bury again. Near the end of the session, the lead federal investigator read Eli Carter's handwritten statement into the official court record. The room fell completely silent afterward. Even the company attorneys stopped writing. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly while the words echoed through the courtroom one final time. They are going to blame the dead. But they couldn't anymore. The federal ruling ordered compensation reviews reopened for dozens of mining families connected to falsified negligence findings. Blackstone Mining faced enormous fines, mandatory oversight, and multiple criminal investigations still continuing beyond Montana. Tunnel 7 itself would remain permanently sealed, not hidden, memorialized. When the hearing ended, reporters surrounded Naomi outside beneath cold autumn wind sweeping through Helena streets. One asked the question everyone expected. How does it feel to finally win? Naomi looked toward the courthouse steps for several moments before answering. Win. The word sounded strange to her. Eli was still dead. 12 miners were still buried beneath the mountain. Entire families had spent decades surviving grief the company intentionally deepened. So Naomi answered honestly, "It feels like they can finally stop lying about the men who never came home." That quote appeared in newspapers across 3 states the next morning. But the real victory happened quietly weeks later back in Blackstone Valley. The company removed Eli Carter's negligence ruling from official records. His name was restored alongside the other miners killed in the collapse. No disciplinary notation, no operator fault, only the truth. Killed during preventable structural failure inside Tunnel 7. Naomi stood alone at the cemetery the afternoon she received the updated record. Wind moved softly through dry grass between the headstones while distant mountains glowed gold beneath lowering sunlight. She carried the official document folded carefully inside her coat pocket. For a long time, she simply stood there looking at Eli's grave. Then she placed the corrected report beside the flowers and rested one hand lightly against the cold stone. "They know now," she whispered. The valley did too. And perhaps most importantly, the widows knew they had not imagined the betrayal all those years. Blackstone Mining had buried truth underground beside the miners. Naomi Carter brought it back into daylight. The first winter, after the investigation ended, arrived earlier than expected. Snow covered the western ridge before Halloween, softening the abandoned mining roads and burying old tire tracks beneath clean white drifts. The valley looked quieter now, though not in the same way it once had. Before, silence in Blackstone Valley meant fear. Now it felt closer to morning finally allowed to breathe. Naomi still lived on the mountain above Tunnel 7. Most people assumed she would leave after the hearings ended. Leah once joked she could probably write a book, move somewhere warmer, maybe even work for one of the labor organizations that contacted her after the case became national news. But Naomi never wanted another life. She wanted the truth returned to the one already stolen. So instead of leaving, she repaired the old loading shack piece by piece. Walter helped reinforce the roof before heavy snow arrived. Miguel installed a proper ventilation pipe through the stove wall during autumn. Former miners donated lumber, tools, and old furniture rescued from storage barns and garages around the valley. Nobody called it charity. People simply started bringing things. A table, a lantern, shelves, photographs, memories. By December, the shack no longer looked abandoned. The outer walls remained weathered, and the mountain wind still slipped through certain corners during storms, but warm light now glowed through the repaired windows every evening. Naomi kept the cast-iron stove burning almost constantly once temperatures dropped below freezing. Near the back wall, she built long wooden shelves holding copied records from the investigation, safety complaints, recovered letters, payroll documents, photographs of miners, and statements from widows who finally agreed to tell their stories publicly. Not a museum exactly. Something quieter. A place where the valley could remember honestly. On certain weekends, families climbed the western ridge together, carrying coffee thermoses and work gloves. Older miners explained tunnel maps to grandchildren who had only heard fragments of the disaster before. Widows sat beside the stove sharing stories they once buried because nobody wanted to hear them. Naomi rarely spoke the most during those gatherings. She mostly listened, and every time she listened, the valley seemed to grow lighter. One evening, near Christmas, Rose Donnelly arrived, carrying a cardboard box wrapped carefully beneath blankets. "I found these in my attic," the old woman said softly. Inside were dozens of letters written by miners over 40 years earlier. Safety complaints, payroll disputes, notes to wives before dangerous shifts. One envelope still carried coal dust fingerprints along the edges. Rose sat quietly beside the stove while Naomi sorted through them. "For years I thought keeping them made me weak," Rose admitted. Naomi looked up. "No," she said gently, "keeping them is why they survived." Outside, snow drifted steadily through pine trees while the mountain disappeared into darkness beyond the windows. For the first time in decades, the widows no longer looked ashamed when they spoke their husbands' names aloud. That mattered more than lawsuits ever could. By early spring, state officials announced plans to place a permanent memorial near the base of the Western Ridge, honoring the miners killed in Tunnel 7 and other preventable Blackstone accidents uncovered during the investigation. The company tried objecting at first. Nobody listened. On the morning the memorial opened, nearly the entire valley gathered beneath cold blue skies at the foot of the mountain road. Folding chairs lined the clearing while old miners stood shoulder to shoulder wearing heavy work coats and faded union caps. Naomi almost did not speak during the ceremony. But Walter quietly touched her arm before it began. "You carried them this far," he said. "They should hear your voice now." So Naomi stepped forward beneath the mountain wind with Eli's lunch pail held gently in both hands. She looked out across the crowd slowly. At Leah, at Rose, at children who never truly knew the men buried underground, at widows who spent years believing grief was something to survive privately. Then Naomi spoke simply. This valley was taught to forget people once they stopped being useful. The wind moved softly through the trees around them, but the men buried in that mountain were never disposable, and neither were the families left behind. No applause followed immediately, only silence. Not fearful silence this time. Respectful silence, the kind that settles when people finally hear something true enough they do not want to interrupt it. After the ceremony ended, most of the crowd drifted slowly back toward town. Naomi remained behind, near the memorial stones, while evening sunlight stretched across the ridge. Walter eventually left, too. Then Leah. Soon, only Naomi remained beneath the mountain. She climbed the road back toward the shack alone, just as the first cold stars appeared above the western trees. The stove still glowed warmly inside when she opened the door. The room smelled like cedar smoke, old paper, coffee grounds, and worn timber. Home. Naomi removed her gloves slowly and placed Eli's lunch pail back onto the shelf beside the copied ledgers and photographs. Then she walked to the window, overlooking the sealed entrance of Tunnel 7 far below. Snowmelt water moved quietly along the rocks near the old tracks now. The mountain looked calmer somehow, not innocent, but no longer entirely buried beneath lies. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the window frame while dusk settled across the valley. Years earlier, she thought survival meant enduring silence. Now she understood something different. A person could lose a house, a job, a future, even someone they loved more than themselves. But if the truth survived long enough to be spoken aloud, then something else could survive too. A name, a dignity, a reason to stand again. And far below the western ridge, where the sealed tunnel disappeared into darkness beneath stone and snow, the wind moved softly through the pines like the valley itself was finally exhaling.